Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to have a chance to speak with Alex Ebert and Thomas Jockin, both thinkers and individuals from whom I have learned a lot. And I always appreciate the chance to speak with both our top-notch scholars. And I find them elegant in their thinking, and I think their thinking is actually getting at the heart of matters that need to be taken seriously. And Mr. Jockin has taught classes on beauty. Alex has submitted papers to at Philosophy Portal, the Hegel anthologies, the anthologies that we did on Nietzsche, logic, just wonderful work, and freak theory. He does excellent work on, and both gentlemen have always made time to come to the net, which has been very, very enjoyable. So something that came up in a net episode a bit ago was this topic of the collapse of the good and the beautiful. And is it a problem? Is it not a problem? What do we mean by these terms? And why are there stakes in it? Why are there not stakes in it? And I really appreciate this chance. But I was just going to start by basically first just asking Alex, a little bit about freak theory, maybe kind of weaving it into the topic of beauty and goodness. Then I'm going to ask Mr. Jockin about the topic of beauty and his work and his thinking. And just thank you both for your time today. And so, Mr. Ebert, if I were to ask you to just talk about freak theory or anything relevant to the topic, what would you say, my friend?
Well, maybe just a quick background on how I hit on freak theory for a second. So I'm a musician. Normally, I'm in the studio. I'm looking at waveforms all day, and there's something called compression, which is a hot topic, especially in the late 90s when digital compression started and people were able to really maximize the volume. And I put that in quotations because things aren't actually getting louder. There's a loudness perception happening because there's less quietness. So the ceiling is still the limit. These concepts will all come into effect in a minute. The limit remains the same. There's a systemic limit, but the troughs, the valleys are being lifted up to the peaks so that there is strictly peak. So if you look at like one of those, albums from that era, you'll see that the only gaps, the only dynamics in the entire album is the space between songs. Otherwise, it's all peak. Now, what is a peak that is always a peak? It's a plateau. It's actually a flat line. It's ground. It's no longer a dynamic topography, right? This process of saturating space, I came to realize, long story short, that this is the process of emergence and that there is a relationship between excess and absence, where once you have a sufficiently saturated space, you have the phenomenological quality of absence, which is itself produced by unification. So that process of having all these differentiated aspects within a space, then saturating that space, makes each of those differences undifferentiatable, right? You cannot tell the difference between the different waveforms, which makes it a unitary object. So there is a relationship now between unification and absence, and unification and the production of a single object, which is now the waveform. Instead of the waveform previously being this multivariated object, which is not an object. An object that is constantly in flux is not an object. It's a system comprised of objects, a system with sub-objects. So you'd be like, oh, this peak is an object, this trough is an object. But once that space is saturated, you have a single object, which is just a giant chunk of waveform, right? This is obviously going, or not obviously, but this is going to be part of our conversation, what I'm going to be bringing to our conversation when we talk about the collapse of anything into anything. Because what this describes, everything I just described, is a collapse. It is a frequency collapse from one peak to the other, where everything gloms and unifies, and thereby the interiority of that unification becomes relationally absent. And that relational absence produces a unitary presence that I call the object. So when we talk about the collapse of the good into beauty, or the problem of the collapse of the good and beauty, I basically just gave away my position by saying in. So the problem of the collapse of the good and beauty, in my view, is a collapse of the good into beauty,
Mm.
or at the very least, whatever terms we want to use, of one thing into another thing. So we get this sense of interiority and exteriority, where the interior may be indeterminate, and that's what lends the unitary trait of a singular object to the external representation of that system. So anyway, hopefully that made some sense. All of that is what I basically call freak theory. And all of that relates to emergence, generally speaking, and describes a transdeterminate, or I shouldn't say a transdeterminate, describes the transdeterminate nature of the dialectic, which I think is terribly misunderstood, the dialectic. Everyone throws that word around. The dialectic is very, very much more slippery and far more interesting once you include the interior exterior lens, because when we realize that the indeterminate is the internal representation of the determinate exteriority, all of a sudden everything gets topsy-turvy, and reality begins to get described with incredible accuracy, in my view. So anyway, that's my spiel on that.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and I'll give it to Jockin here in a moment just to discuss his work and etc. And I always appreciated how you used freak theory to help elucidate toward the end of the doctrine of being in Hegel's science of logic, with the repelling and the attracting. And I can't help but read that section now and not think of your work. So I found that very, very, very useful. And I also always remember one of your presentations where you'll talk about the windshield and all of the bugs start hitting it. And there's a certain point where you can't see anything. And there's a saturation that occurs. And I also I find very interesting when you talk about collapse into, because most of the time when we think about collapse, it's collapse down, collapse kind of down. Collapse into is very interesting because there's something paradoxical about that, that as you were speaking, it just struck me as kind of capturing a bit of the spirit of what you're talking to. When it collapses into something, there's a certain breaking down that's nevertheless actually a filling in almost. There's an interesting sort of double move, I'll have to think, and collapse into. Into is very, very interesting. But Mr. Jockin, if I were to ask you about your work, thought, and et cetera, so forth from there, thank you for being here.
This is fun. It's fun to actually have a chance to reflect. I like Ebert's method. It gives some context of where his thinking is coming from.
Yeah.
Because I haven't done that in a very long time. So I think it's very appropriate to do that at this time. So my background is a designer. So visual designer. My specialty is in typeface design. So I make fonts. Because my training was originally in that. And especially what became my subtopic area of focus was on typography to improve reading performance. So how can typographic interventions basically improve reading performance? So that was basically my career. Now, parallel to that, I've been teaching for almost 15 years now in design, different universities, but that's not more relevant to why I'm bringing that up. Is it's ironic that in design, as a subfield or a field related to art, that one would think you're dealing with beauty, but yet it never gets discussed. And actually, a lot of times in the reality of, in terms of practice, it's generally more engineering. You're worrying about the goodness of things. This is working, kind of a goodness quality of function. That's generally how it goes. It either goes in that direction or it's a subjectivity, cultural pneumos kind of relationship. It's basically a kind of visual persuasion. I think towards the end of my career, like basically at a major point in my career, I started thinking about these questions from professional practice review. It seemed like the answers that were given to us in school and our practice and training really could not answer accelerating technological development, because digital typography has been around for 30 years at this point. So kind of this AI is just kind of one more push in this direction of trend. So the big idea though is that the equipment of thought that got designed as a practice, and design is a relatively young practice. It's basically post World War II. Maybe you can argue a little earlier, maybe World War I, around that range. A lot of our historical sourcing will quote from that period or talk about it. Bauhaus is a very famous example as a kind of a linchpin moment for design education. But thought, and which is interesting, is actually German idealism kind of mediated through some pedagogical training of Germany around that time period, like the kindergarten movement, for example. But the point is, like, thought has not really developed past that, or thought really through that process. So obviously, because beauty was, I think, a lot of reason why people will get into the arts. People get in the arts for many reasons, but beauty is one of those things we think why we do it, at least why I did it in the first place. So I went back to, I said, I'm going to start reading. This is about 15 years ago. I'm going to start reading. I'm going to start from the beginning. So we'll go to Plato and Aristotle, and we'll begin there. Come to find out that, contrary to our cultural social norms or expectation and assumptions what beauty is, as a kind of subjectivity, pleasure, principle of preference, we see it's quite a very different object. It's actually the most important object for Plato and Aristotle. And contrary to even the argument that the good is the actual strongest orientation ontologically of the transcendentals for Greek thought of Plato and Aristotle, you actually find out that you can make a very strong case it's actually beauty. Telos. So, and you can normally catch this because the English translations will get away with it by just saying the fine, the noble. They'll try to use other language to obfuscate what it's actually being said. It's beauty, time and time again. And in fact, actually, every time I reread these thinkers, it gets revealed to me one more time. I can quote multiple dialogues from Plato, for example, where beauty is not just this subjectivity or even a question of appearance. This is generally what usually gets presented to you if you read scholars on Plato and Aristotle's thought about beauty as a kind of appearance. You find out actually is the ontological ground and horizon for all being from the get-go. The purpose of virtue in Aristotle is for the beautiful. All the virtues are for beauty. That's their purpose. For example, beauty is the horizon of understanding, to see the ontos into ontos, the real being of reality. The quote from Symposium, for example, the relationship of beauty to love stays in Phaedrus. Even very interesting enough, in the most difficult texts, Parmenides or Timaeus, these very kind of ontological discussions, beauty, the form of beauty, is the thing being pushed on as the point of all these discussions. So I find that if Plato and Aristotle are thinking the beauty is such a critical part of their entire account, it seems disingenuous to dismiss it, to say, well, no, they got it all wrong. There are multiple reasons for that. And actually, the reason why I think I've been very interested in talking with Ebert is because one of the major qualities of the beautiful is that it has this relationship to excess, to magnitude. It actually must be there. One of the greatest mistakes that happened in philosophical thought was to bifurcate awe from beauty. That was one of the biggest mistakes. The reason why is because beauty has this power of basically not just through urea, right, in terms of apprehensional viewing. It also is of a kind of wonder. The word for wonder in Greek also draws at this kind of magnitude. So the general project, like I got interested in it, was asking this hypothetical question, which I not wrote the text yet, so I don't have a systematic theory, unfortunately, to talk about this. But how would you apply this understanding of the beautiful to design? I think it'd be a completely different order of magnitude of result. I think because the entire orientation of design education and practice has been not about this. And in fact, it's been quite a language developed with Javier Rivera and Michelle Gardner, basically in a conversation after the Stumping Ground. The idea of the geopedic versus the algorithmic got revealed as a way to demarcate the difference. Algorithmic processes seem to work as vectors of operation, cognized around operations of good, either cultural, social goods or individual private goods. Those things get operationalized, systematized, and can scale. Design has been basically completely accounted for that process. Even though there's a lot of kind of cultural, social kind of angst in design that we feel like we don't want to do that, but yet that's the only process when we can design, because no one's presented a proper account. Now, I think under these circumstances is why we go back to philosophy. We actually need an account to reorient ourselves. And if I'm going to give any language to describe what would that be, it would be the geopedic. This kind of play from in terms of algebra, from geometry, and instead of kind of operational rhythmic pedia for play. So kind of a completely reorientation of not necessarily dismissal of the algorithmic, but reorienting it in a proper relationship. So that plays up in terms of going back to Plato and Aristotle to understand their account anew. So obviously there are and generally the reason why we dismiss them is because their material account of the science is dismissed. Once you take that away, boom, you can just ignore everything else they're saying. I don't think that's very fair. The most important reason is Aristotle had empirical instruments of perception like we do. He would probably agree with all the points being made in modern science, as an example. So I think once we give that fairness points to Aristotle, especially, I think that's a reasonable. I think we can go back to these thinkers and rethink through them again and see them come to completely different conclusions. I think with our understanding we've gone through in history, and then go back in the past and read these thinkers again. That's also why I think a big area is place is very important, kind of because Aristotle especially talks about this. I'm going on a little too long, so I'm going to pause for now. But this is why, like another course I'm working on is on health, and we find that for Aristotle, especially, or even Plato, health actually has a very important element of connection, the material particular with the universal. And this is also, by the way, why beauty is given this essential stance as opposed to goodness and truth. It's because it is only in the beautiful that the particularity of this individual of a primary substance can be unified with its secondary substance. Basically, the all in one, the one and the many are basically harmonized and synchronized in the apprehension of the beautiful. That's in terms of the big project about what my claim, my big thrust. Now I can point to that's a strong statement I could be easily pushed back on, but that's like the thrust point about if we reoriented our political, social production, arts around this understanding of the beautiful. The hypothesis is you would get a very different outcome than what we have now. And one of the ways I can at least gesture to it is that generally all these processes have been operated on the algorithmic as opposed to the geophysic. And that's what I got so far. Obviously, there's a lot I didn't go over, but I want to just try to keep this tight as much as I can.
Magnificent. I really appreciate it. And what you were saying about needing an account, it makes me think of an opening paper in Thoughts. It's called Ideas Are Practically Eyes. And the issue is that you can't separate ideas and pragmatism because what you believe is practical and what you should do is relative to your worldview. So you always have ideas and practice. And part of the problem is if indeed, take your time, if indeed there has been a loss of beauty, then there is a loss of the account needed to understand that account in those works. So there's an enclosure that occurs, right? And that's always kind of the problem, is if there is something really important that has been lost, then also is lost the account needed to see the thing that has been lost. And at that point, it almost seems like the only way you get it back is by continually running into problems that you can't address, that you lack resources to address, and then you start facing all of the significant consequences of it. And there's a certain point where perhaps, to use Mr. Ebert's language, perhaps there's a certain point of a saturation of your attempts at the good, and none of those efforts at the good actually are sufficient, that forces a certain collapse of them into a different account, which of course is the beautiful here. But then if you don't have the account of the beautiful, there's a collapse into a something that you don't know what that something is. And then what's a very interesting question is, by what standard do people go about then looking for this sort of sense, this groping around in the darkness? I always like the end of the book, Waiting for the Barbarians by Cosetti. And he has this line where one of the characters, they have burn marks in the middle of their eyes. And so they can't see directly in front of them. But there's this line of, I've been looking at something my entire life and I can't see it. And I think there's almost something inevitable about the human condition when we lack accounts, that then we get to this point where we feel like there's something we're looking at that we don't see. And that is interesting how that sense of a lack then actually becomes the directing. And then what's interesting about this idea of beauty, and then also the saturation that Ebert is pointing to, is that lack is actually not nothing. It is actually a certain excess that there then has to be faculties to grasp. But then the question is, how do you gain those faculties? Well, virtue, philosophy, the arts, certain practices and works, and so on. So I think it all connects very, very well. But I think a lot about the problem, how if you're missing an account you're also missing an account that you're missing the account. So how do you even begin the process of reclaiming this thing that is lost? Well, again, it seems to you just keep bumping upon a problem you can't address. You keep bumping upon something that doesn't go away. And eventually that forces you to acknowledge that you're lacking something. You start to go, well, maybe there's something lacking. And that's kind of the penny drop that begins a certain investigation. But there then has to be people willing to do that work. So I appreciate you both. I suppose just an opening question, you know, there's always this idea of the three infinites, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And people talk about those in different ways. The first question could be, what do we think the true is? And then another question after we go through that could be, do we think that they are co-equal? That they are somehow like beauty is higher than them all, but in beauty you get the good and the true as well, but not necessarily the other way around. There are different ways to talk about it. But if I were to ask you, and I'll start with Ebert and then Jockin, what is the true? I'd be curious how you'd respond. For me, I always think about Jonathan Rauch in Kindly Inquisitors. He has this idea where he's very much inspired by Karl Popper, and he's trying to defend free speech, and he's trying to make a distinction between knowledge and belief. And what he says knowledge is that of which no one in particular would experience, right? Like you would get the same general pattern. He's talking about the scientific method. And the idea of the scientific method is that anyone in the laboratory under those conditions would see the same result. It is not person particular, right? And so that's the idea that's knowledge versus belief is not something that the person involved is fungible. Now, of course, this asks the question, is there a difference between fact and truth? Because maybe that's fact, but what's truth then? Or is truth and fact similes? And those get into distinctions. Maybe the truth is the framework by which we even wonder about facts or can even define facts, because it's more of the worldview. And then, of course, then worldview, if that's the case, goes to good and beauty. But I'll pause there and I'll just ask, do we have any thoughts of what is the truth, what the word truth means? Mr. Ebert.
This isn't to throw a stone from my very glass house. This is a 2-3 part sort of like volley. Number one, for whatever reason, I've never found myself attracted to the type of philosophy which says, what is beauty? What is milk? All of these concepts are fundamentally unstable. Like we might as well be saying, what is milk? What is air? What is a microphone? The idea of the instability of a concept is more interesting as a fundamental project in and of itself. So for me, for instance, the very instability of a positive implies the potentiality of its negative. So all the things, the microphone that I am looking at here is all the things that it is not subtracted from it. So it is the absence of, it is the constraint which constrains microphone from everything else, from its other affordances. Now, if I happen to need a chin rest, microphone becomes something else, right? Suddenly now microphone has a second affordance. It's not just for recording. Or if I need to hammer something and I don't have a hammer, suddenly microphone has now a new affordance. And I can mine its affordances from this indeterminate negativity that lies beyond the current present constraints of the thing. Now, if I bring that to truth, I just don't know. What do you want me to do? Like, what is truth? I have a song called Truth, right? It's like one of my more famous songs.
Great whistle, great whistle.
be like, what do you mean you don't know what truth is? You have a whole song about it. Are you serious? The truth that's expressed in that song is a revealing. It is scary. So there is something phenomenologically distinct about an encounter with truth. And this comes toward Thomas invoking awe. And there is something about truth which is unsettling, precisely because I would say truth is the recognition that the concept is unstable. So when we say what is truth, instead of trying to converge on a distinct answer, to me, truth is the very predicament of the transdeterminate nature of experience, such that we can have one thing, think it's that thing, and then realize that it has an infinite number of affordances, to realize that the concept of the thing is simply conceptualized through a constraint system, which negates all the things that it temporarily isn't. And so that when I am telling someone the truth, I'm revealing something they didn't already know, such that truth is dynamic. Truth, phenomenologically at the very least, isn't something that feels stable. Well, I know that thing. Okay, so anyway, such that the idea of converging on a unitary definition of truth, I would say that, and I'm more interested in phenomenology. This comes back to awe. I think it definitely comes to beauty, and I think it also relates to the good. And it throws into question the sort of the scientific objectivity that you're referring to. But truth does not necessarily refer to knowledge. I think truth refers to an experience of knowledge. And I think in that sense, truth is dynamic. And I think in that sense, truth is a moving target and is more of an experience. So if I was to tell you, hey, listen, like I am, whatever. I have some secret and I'm telling you this secret. I'm going to divulge this thing. You might be like, oh, wow, that's his truth. Okay, so he's telling me something that's true. I didn't know it was hidden. So I'm being revealed a hidden affordance. Now, if you get used to that as me, I don't think it's any longer relevant whether or not it's true. I don't think that you would think of it as true. If I was to say, hey guys, guess what? I'm gay. You'd be like, whoa, truth bomb, right? Then there's this, I keep thinking of this amazing thing when Norm Macdonald is on Larry King, and Larry King's like, do you have anything else to say? And he's like, yes, I'm a deeply closeted gay man. And Larry King is like, are you coming out right now? Are you going, no, 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 no. But you just said you're gay. I'm a deeply closeted gay man. So he made, that's one way to preserve the truthfulness of a statement, right? Is to continually retract it and hide it and cloak it and retain the hidden affordance, the oblique aspect of it. And I think truth is always referring to something that is newly revealed, that is, that it was oblique and is now coming into view. In that sense, I think truth is more phenomenological than objective. And I think that folds into the conversation regarding beauty, certainly with regard to awe. I think when we experience truth, there is an initial problematization, there is initial disruption of the automaticity of the granted statement. And just to say one last thing, truth having that disruptive quality does, in a sense, disappear. And this comes back to my saturation aspect. And again, I'm talking phenomenologically. If I have reconciled entirely, and I just love using objects in front of me, so sorry, I know it can be tedious, but if I have never encountered this and someone's like, yeah, you pour stuff into it and you can drink it, I'm like, wow, okay. So suddenly I see something new, and maybe that, gives me an experience of awe at first. And maybe there is even something to do with truth there. But once I have integrated this and it is automatic so that I just grab it without thinking, I wouldn't necessarily say that my knowledge of this produces any experience. If it is fully integrated and I'm not any longer thinking about it, which is the entire purpose of the apparatus of the brain, which is to converge thought on thoughtlessness, because that is the most efficient state that we run our brains in, I don't think we can any longer talk about the truth, like not in any meaningful way. So that if I have completely figured out my environment, there is not necessarily anything true about it any longer. In fact, the purpose of figuring out the environment was to sort of collapse the experience of truth within the environment, such that I'm no longer encountering truth. So in that sense, I would use truth as a disruptive phenomenological force that gets us acquainted with a reality that helps us to erase the experience of truth. Because I don't think the experience of truth is particularly pleasant. I think it's very disruptive to the automaticity of experience.
Well, I love that answer. I'll give it to Jockin here. I think this is also very important because if we're asking the question, what is true regarding the collapse of the good and the beautiful, the question is, what does the word true mean? And if the word true means a disrupted phenomenological force, if you will, then there's a question of whenever we ask the relation between the good and the beautiful, there better be a disruptive phenomenological force at play, or what we are describing is not quote unquote true in the sense as distinct. The problem is I think most people conflate the words true and fact. And this is where I think we get into a lot of trouble, because you also said something very important, which is Blondel noted that when we're certain of something, we stop caring about it. So your brain is entirely in the business of making the environment something you don't think about, which in that moment of being true, because it knows everything, it vanishes. This concealment structure of truth, as distinct from fact, is extremely important. It makes me think of where Heidegger is always talking about this unveiling, this coming forth that simultaneously conceals. He later in his life is writing the word being with a dash through it. There's something about truth that always has a dash through it, because the moment it is there, it has to be gone or it is not truth. So truth has an unveiling structure to it. It has to have this unveiling and unfolding structure. And of course, what you said right off the bat that I love so much is truth is this one-for-one identification is very problematic. Absolutely. You also point out in your work the equivalence versus the equal sign. And I can't help but talk about Korobowski and Science and Sanity, saying that identification is a mental disease that has destroyed human thinking, because we're always looking for identity, a stable identification that doesn't exist in nature, actually. So it makes us mad and we go crazy. And he's actually arguing that what is needed is a science of sanity is going to basically, to use your words, be based on a notion of truth that is this disruptive character, or it's a geometry. It is a situation. And a geometry is something that is unstable, because you can never see it in all sides all at once, and you have to unfold with it. But I think this is extremely important just to start, and I'll give it to Jockin, is because if we don't establish that when we're asking what is true about the relation of the good and the beautiful, if it is not established that what we are looking for is some sort of disruptive force, well, then you're going to end up in a question of identification. And in fact, I think identification is sometimes lurking in simply overly treating good, beautiful, and true as interchangeable without any mechanism of, say, perhaps collapsing into or all that actually is perhaps making that mistake, because you're looking for the truth as a stable state, which is an equal sign, and that leads to actually flattening and lots of trouble. So I really like what you were saying. Please, Mr. Ebert.
Just, like I said, this conversation, when we talk about these big, bold, beautiful terms, is I'm just sort of baby-footing into it. But I realize that maybe the way that I could most succinctly describe it, and everything you said just now is really helpful. We have good and beauty, and in my view, and hopefully this will makes sense with regard to my opening statement and what we end up talking about. And as far as I can tell, we're not going to be disagreeing too much on some of this stuff, is that you have the determinate vector, let's say, to invoke Jockin's previous conversational term, and I think it's helpful as I talk about this kind of thing a lot. You have the determinate sort of object of the vector, and then you have this sort of indeterminate mesh of the matrix within, which is comprised of vectors. And to bring this further into freak theory, you have the exterior of the good, which is comprised of an interior, which is indeterminate, which is beauty. That this is what I'll be proposing, is that the externality of good is actually comprised of and only afforded by the saturated interiority, which is basically beauty, which is the indeterminate interiority of beauty. So the good is the external of the internal beauty. Now we don't see this all the time, because when we're looking at something externally, we think it's simply an object. And we want to just know the thing as the thing and not question or consider its infinite interior, the infinity afforded by the very limit which produces the sort of skin of the object. So that very skin, that limitation that produces the unitary object, that limit which produces that externality or that exterior, is what allows for the saturative interior to produce an indeterminate interiority, the indeterminate infinity, all of which, we can say are that object's oblique affordances, right? Anyway, so we have good exterior object, we have its interiority, which is an infinite beauty. And then between them, we have this question that introduces the observer, which is truth. Wait a minute, I see the object, but what is its truth? And so we have the sort of Kantian question of what is the thing in itself? Well, we cannot know the thing in itself, which he rightly says. Why can't we know the thing in itself? Because the thing in itself, and this is what Kant didn't understand, what Hegel brought along, the thing within itself is infinite. And that very infinity, that very saturation, and when I talk about saturation, I talk about the process which produces that infinity, which is a process of saturation. And saturation of what? A saturation of vectors, a saturation of prior vectors, which then conglomerates into a unitary trait, which is the good object. So when we have the good, we have beauty, which is the interior of the good, and then we have the question, which is the introduction of the observer, which is, yes, but what is true? Is it the object or the beauty? Is it the known, determinate thing? But truth asks, yes, but what is the truth of the interior of that known, determinate thing? And that's when we get thrown into the infinite indeterminate. And so I think we have a brilliant a trinity here, where we have the good, which is seemingly objective. We have the beauty, which is seemingly objective, but then we introduce truth, which then combines the two and creates a dialectic between the two. And the dialectic, from my point of view, is an external, internal, exteriority, interiority, determinate, indeterminate, dialectic. So anyway, I just wanted to introduce that.
Lovely. Would it be fair to say, just as a quick comment, that beauty then is something you have to be in it. Beauty cannot be experienced in any other way but in it.
I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think it depends. It's a great question. So when we go back to awe, and what Jockin said at the very beginning is amazing. I always get nicely surprised when I'm like, oh, you know that. Well, that's wonderful, because the bifurcation of beauty and awe that Jockin cites as like a massive problem, definitely certainly one of the biggest. Because, and by the way, because phenomenology. So once you bifurcate the two and you allow beauty to exist as it's on its own, you extract the subject and basically put the subject off to the side, and you're no longer doing proper philosophy at that point. But when you get confronted with beauty, the phenomenology of being confronted with beauty, confronted with it, is that you're not on the inside of it.
Yeah.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's the integration of the beauty that determines, by the way, whether it's an awesome or awful experience.
Yes.
The integration of the beauty disappears the beauty. But I just wanted to say that once you're on the inside of beauty, I was literally thinking about exactly this before we hopped on the call. Once you're on the inside of beauty, if you're experiencing, this all depends on what you're experiencing. If you're experiencing determinate vectors on the inside of the matrix, you're not experiencing beauty. You're experiencing determinate, you're just operating with knowns, right? You're not being confronted with the indeterminate truth of something.
Yeah.
So there's no problem. But when you are, and this is a transient experience, but when you get confronted with the beauty, in a certain sense, you are thrown into the indeterminate, you're thrown into an indeterminate state. And in that state, you are isomorphic to the beauty. So, and this is an important equivalent to the beauty, topologically, relationally equivalent. I like using the word isomorphic, but for some people, they're like, what the fuck is that? But it's just basically the same. You're resonant, you're co-resonant with the beauty. The beauty is indeterminate, and you temporarily are indeterminate. So you're not inside of the beauty. The beauty's not inside of you. It hasn't integrated yet. But for that moment, and this is why God exists as a concept, in my view. God exists as a concept because we experience a resonance from indeterminate to indeterminate. We'll experience awe, something that is indeterminate, that we can't categorize readily, and that experience throws us into an indeterminate state, and that creates a literal mathematical resonance. And that's the experience of sort of like universal unity, where you have the one in the many and the many in the one.
Well, I'll just say quickly, what to me is very interesting, when I think about the experience of beauty, there's the simultaneously in it, but also not it. That lack and excess are together. There's this certain overwhelm, but lack. And then also thinking about the good, the true, and the beautiful, what's very interesting, when I think in memory about all experiences, I can't actually remember them of the same quality as the all at the time. I can only know they were good. Oh, that was good. So I'm thinking about your friend, like in it, there's a kind of in it that you have to be to really get the quality of the beautiful. When in memory, you can remember it was all, but you're not going to have the same intensity of experience, but I can know it was good. But the truth then disables that very knowing to keep me active toward the experience, because I know I have to be in a certain unfolding. So I was just thinking about that as you were speaking, but I'll pause and give it to Mr. Jockin on anything at all.
Where to begin? I mean, Ebert gave me so much to work with. But I'll start with Daniel, your reply, because actually I think I talk about this. Now, here's what I'll tell you what truth is not. It is not the correspondence of proposition to reality. Because quite honestly, that then means basically truth is just mimesis.
Yeah.
That's what propositions are. They're symbolic objects that they're an image. So that's actually no different than saying beauty is basically a painting, a depiction of entities, and the reality connection, the likeness of connection between the painting and the object painted. That's beauty. No, just like we say, no, that's not what beauty is. I can also say the traditional stance of truth from a scholastic point of view as the agreement, the correspondence of proposition to fact, to external reality. It's not truth. So I agree with. So actually, on a Heidegger note, I appreciate it was brought up because that's aletheia. So it's presence, and actually, it's specifically what Ebert talked about: the movement of the manifest and the hidden. It's in the movement of the two that are revealing that shows up in presence. That is always excess, but and this is the catch: that revealing of truth is always within a count, logos. So I usually translate logos as the count for this exact reason. There are infinite logi in terms of any situation can be presented by many, many, many accounts. All of them are equally valid. All of them are right. So actually a big one too. So I'm going to demolish the correspondence theory of truth on that side. And now I'm going to now demolish the rightness account. Rightness is not truth. Because you could be absolutely right in an account and yet miss the truth in terms of the real reality of what's going on. Because when then it comes to the question, how do you determine which account is legitimate, which account is the truth, not just right? Usually ends up, you got a couple of options. One is relevance. That's usually almost always the immediate thrust, which actually presents a kind of subjectivity point. So now we're still in a problem of truth, because now truth, if it's not correspondence, because that just means it's mimicry, so that doesn't follow, because it's dependent on the subject. Then you go to relevance, same problem. It's still a subject who has to determine what is that relevancy. You still got that problem. The closest we can get to, and by the way, what Ebert was talking about with affordances, that's a design concept. That's huge. That's actually really important because it does point out. Now, this is why the correspondence theory was presented, is that nature and reality is full of affordances. Reality is symbolic because things present to us as affordances, but those affordances are based on accounts, and those accounts are actually modes of knowledge. Because that's the big thing, and usually we collapse knowledge into episteme in terms of just scientific universal knowledge. Which is kind of awkward. It's just very awkward in the modern world because usually most of our knowledge is statistical probabilities, which are of the variable. We was very blended. It doesn't really necessarily map exactly how the Greeks thought. But the point is, though, technes are knowledge. Because the reason why I say that, because the body, of course, possessing of knowledge has a certain dispositional orientation, and that produces certain effects. So, and actually one of the most important things Plato ever did, thank God, was when the issue became, how do we know things are real? One of the things he made presented in Cratylus was to say actions are real. So if actions are real, that gives us some safeguarding to understand some reality. Because that's one of the things about revealing. Revealing is an event of an activity. And account and technes, in terms of activities, produce things. They either do enactments or they produce things. So, which by the way is actually Aristotle's definition of what technes are. They are poesis making with truth. Very interesting. Very interesting. I always find that line very interesting. And the lack of technes is making production without truth. What that means is fascinating. But one last note related to the idea of affordances. Plato has a really interesting note in Meno, where he talks about the fleeting, basically he talks about beauty being these things that are revealed, but then we need the chain of causation to lock them in so we can understand it. So this idea of this is why I'm kind of circling back on this point of accounts as a kind of chaining, as a point of it's actually not the thing itself. It's actually just an attempt for us to try to grab at it enough. A lot of language of knowledge is about grabbing. I kind of get a hold of it so that we can understand it. But of course, the reality is much more fleeting in terms of its quality. I think the closest we can get to it are things like, and by the way, another note is actually what Ebert's bringing up about the idea of normative fluency. It's totally true in the sense of guess what we're all operationalized to do? Move things into the background. The play of figure-ground relationship is absolutely essential. And the figure ground movement is always to get the ground back so you can reveal a presence in front of you. That's generally what the operation is always about. And design actually is based on that proposition that we control what can be in figure ground, that what we choose to be emphasized may require by necessity things to be receded. If everything's all of equal level, you see nothing. So this idea in the visual arts, or even as normative fluency behavior of apps and user interfaces and things like that, are all based on this logic. Even reading. You read best what you read most. We use that language from literacy, legibility studies. So this idea of we got to clear the ground. So actually, ironically, this idea of clearing is a prerequisite for everything else to even get off the ground. This is partly why I'm showing my hand a little bit. Why I do hold stance that truth is really a prerequisite starting point. It's not the end point of what even goodness or beauty does. Because what Ebert said in the second part. I'm reminded immediately of Aquinas' notion of the three modes of love. There's the first state of love of desire, right, which is interior to yourself. Then there's the ecstatic love of running out within yourself. And then there's what's called the liquefaction love, which removes the boundaries of the beloved and the self. So I'm seeing that very similar what Ebert is talking about, with his notes of interiority, exteriority, and the operation of love. Which, by the way, Daniel, me and you have had discussions about this in other videos about. Isn't it interesting that then truth becomes this kind of relationship to desire and a certain dispositional presentation? So that's my attempt to try to circle back everything that has been said. I have other notes related to even Aquinas has a really interesting line about honesty as a mode of the beautiful. Honestinium. It's a kind of truth. It's so the unity of truth, the combining of truth with beauty is honesty for Aquinas. And it's actually under temperance, which is really fascinating because you would never think that it has all these interesting properties, but we can talk about that second reply.
Sure.
So to close, last note, I think that movement of the hidden and the manifest, I think the closest approximation, and this is really and relates to the making with truth, so thus techne, is a kind of surprising shine, the shining forth of revealing of, and this is either part of the forms that I'm going to circle back to. That's what Ebert was pointing out, was that the flux, like things are not just set affordances. There are many affordances possible by the accounts given to it. But my point, I'm going to kind of be provocative now, is to say what beauty does is reveal new affordances that were priorly unthought of, which always, after the fact, become obvious. They were always there, but they weren't always there. And in fact, they were impossible. The common example I always use from the net sessions was flying. Flying was completely impossible. It was an absolute fantasy. It was pure wish. Absolutely. Because it was contrary to nature in every sense of the word. Yet, what are we going to say? Flying is violence? I mean, contrary of nature? Like, that's the catch. You're either going to have to go down that direction, which there you can actually. Because, by the way, like, airplane crashes got invented as soon as we made airplanes. So, which has an interesting relation of time. So, like, usually one element of violence is the collapsing of time. Usually is how we know this. That's a tangent note. But I'm going to stop talking and give it back to the rear.
No, magnificent. I think on this idea of truth matters because it becomes kind of the starting ground without which you can't even advance. Well, this is a big deal because I think basically the conversation about, say, the good and the beautiful and a lot of stuff, if they're starting from a ground of truth as a stable identification, you're done from the start, right? But if truth is actually this destabilizing unveiling, this movement, well, then we have to rethink when we talk about many things. Say you mentioned honesty. You could talk about telos. You could talk about beauty. Good. All of that then has to be rethought in light of, okay, does it have this characteristic of unveiling, right? Does it have this characteristic of quote unquote shine, of disrupting? If it does not, then whatever understanding or account we give of the thing in question is wrong. It is not correct. Because you're making the mistake of identification that applies to a quote unquote fact. But like you're saying, it assumes a correspondence theory. And of course, as y'all know, I talk all the time about the Gödel point, which is the trade-off between correspondence or coherence. After incompleteness, this doesn't mean there's no such thing as quote unquote truth. It means that truth is not what you think. You can either get coherence for an account, or you can get correspondence for an account. And Gödel means you have to choose between those two. Well, I would say the Gödel point is instead of choosing between those two, you reside and dwell with a faithful presence in the very destability between those two, actually. And that would then be truth in this unveiling characteristic, right? And then we have to think the questions of, say, the good and the beautiful or everything in light of this place of destabilization. And I think it's been a giant mistake to make thinking about identification as opposed to this sort of active phenomenological tearing with, working with, going with. I think that's extremely important. And I think also that if we take that very seriously, then the next question, of course, would be if we take this idea of truth having a certain unveiling to it. Which then, of course, people like Michel Planier in personal knowledge, or I'm thinking Cardinal Newman, you mentioned love, and this is Dante as well. Like the only way to then know the truth of a thing is to actually love it. because that's the only way you're going to stick with it as it unveils itself. And you're going to be willing to actually give up your ideas. Love is where you are willing to not just marry your ideas of the person. Like have it like if you love someone and it's the basis of a stable identity, that's going to be a toxic relationship. There has to be a certain openness to the change and transformation of the people, right? So that they can move to their definitiveness, right? And the same logic then ends up applying to, well, everything. That actually, like the only way to know anything is to have a certain posture of a quote unquote love. Now, the question is, what exactly does that look like? And then the funny thing is, can you actually do that unless you have beliefs in the good, in the beautiful? So I appreciate everything that has been said. I suppose the question that then comes up, if we're to move to the good, is if it is the case that whatever the truth of the good is not a stable identification, but this unveiling structure, this something is coming forth but hiding in the movement itself. What does it mean then to talk about something being good in light of this kind of movement? What does the word good get at? That would, and you know, obviously there are many classical thinkers that link good with the telos of a thing. What is its purpose, right? But of course, telos, if we're thinking a stable identification, is very different than a telos that would be unveiled in the very use and relationship of the thing, which then, wherever he is right now, I wonder if Andrew Luber is looking up and going, theme, dang it, theme. I know he is, wherever he is, because you have this idea of something that unveils itself in the use of that keeps the thing open, that doesn't close, because the moment it closes, you have this stagnant telos that is an identification that is very problematic, as opposed to this thing unveiling yourself as you use it. So, you know, if I would put, it would seem as if there's something, one is using something in a good way that keeps it open. Actually, it has this sort of open character to it that nevertheless is able to address whatever is at hand. Maybe. That's all vague and would have to be unpacked. But if I would throw it at Mr. Ebert, what do you think, Mr. Ebert?
But let me just problematize some of this, but I also want to ask a question. I guess I'll ask the question last, and just so I remember what the question is, I need, I, I have some stuff to say, so I almost want to ask the question, then get the response, and then talk. But I'm going to say the question, come back to it. Somebody describe to me, probably Thomas, if you could describe to me exactly what the problem is of the collapse of the good and the beautiful. This was, in fact, let's just start there because I would love to hear from you. The reason why this got kicked off, I think it was actually Javier who jumped into IDW.
Yes, it was. It was Javier. We blame Javier for instigating this whole situation.
So okay, I've looked this up and I can't quite suss out what. Can you state it?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So there's a couple ways you can talk about it. Some of them are from Daniel that I think he's done a good job re-articulating it, but I'll try my best to close it to do a succinct point. So because most people's understanding of truth is fixed, it is identity based. Thus, the accounts of goodness that come from that generally give a kind of orientation of my necessity that is perfectly logical, that is right, the operation of desire to satisfy that desire, if it runs into it will be zero sum and generally cause conflict. Because, for example, especially when we have the mediation of people with different desires and different goods, how do you mediate those goods? That isn't in force. Now, generally, when we had nation states and democratic society of a kind of post-World War II state, we basically thought we can democratically just come to consensus and rationally, the rational good would obviously work best. It would be logically agreed by everybody, and it would cause an ordering by that order of truth, right? So the goods and desire mediated through the public will via a democratic system would allow for a harmonization of society and the general goodness of society to come out. So there's a political argument. We're seeing that's not happening because now one could point to say this is a truth problem, it's a truthiness issue. One could say that, but I think, I don't want to speak for Daniel, but for me, I don't think that's good enough because the logic of actually the priority is that people really are orienting about good, not truth. truth is just the justification for their goods, for their desire. So if those are, but then if you can't find a way to mediate that we need something superior to goodness to harmonize. And especially if we're not going to use violence or use force to try to mediate this. So from a social, again, my stance, one of the stances is, if beauty considered the way I'm presenting is brought forth, if we just say they're equivalent or correctly convertible one to another, I don't think we have basically Duginism as the stance of, well, then therefore difference cannot be addressed in a way because logos couldn't do it, truth couldn't do it. So therefore we're stuck with nothing else because then goods are.
Sorry, just to, if what are equivalent? You mean beauty and good?
Yes. So if you say the argument that truth isn't going to do the job because rationality is not universal, which was the post-Enlightenment stance, and the democratic process was supposed to use that through the aggregation of the public will. When that fails, which we feel like, I think most of us in this room agree has failed or is failing, one or the other, and especially if you say goods can't be harmonized because they could be inherently contrary to each other. There's no way to mediate them. So we got difference. How do we harmonize that difference? And truth has always been kicked out off the table, and we're stuck in goodness. If there is no way to go to beauty, and to say that beauty is just a kind of goodness, that's it, there's nothing added to it, then we're at a logical impasse. And this is why I said on the next session, there is no other option than basically direct violence or Duginistic isolation. There is no other, you can't give me a logical reason why those are not the true endable conclusions, in my point of view. That's a political stance. My stance, another one, practical stance is basically related to that, is that algorithmic procedures are based on goods, vectors of satisfying desire. Those can be systematized, captured, and replicated. If we basically ask the question, can there be an alternative possibility of our future that is not going to be captured by the algorithm? We have to go to goodness. And one of the ways I help draw out this difference is the fact that we're so captured by goodness, we can't even see beauty because we can't even think of a concept other than algorithm in terms of how to orient ourselves, in terms of our desire, our families, our objects, things like that. So thus why beauty matters, or why it matters in this context, is because if you just say beauty is just a kind of goodness, like they're co-convertible with each other, then you don't really have any intellectual equipment rationally or account-wise to admit with anyone else to think through a new alternative possibility. That's the, I try my best to summarize it, but it's still ran away. I'm sorry.
Okay, so let me just bring you back to your prior statement, which I agreed about, which is that the hidden affordance structure of a given object is beauty, and that the revelation of beauty allows for basically affordance mining or for the new affordances. You said something like that.
Yes.
Okay, so if we think about then beauty as the stable of hidden affordances, as the sort of pool of, let's say, infinite vectors of affordance, vectors of good. Now, I can use the term algorithm for a moment here, just to bring it to algorithm. Let's say we then think of beauty as the stable or pool of infinite algorithms, which one given good could be assigned. Or let's just say each algorithm is a good and one object could be assigned to any of those algorithms / goods. Beauty then would be not an alternative to goods, but the result of a saturation of goods, the result of an infinite pool of goods. Beauty then is an infinite pool of algorithms, an algorithmic saturation. Thus, we can start talking about a dialectical process as opposed to thinking of these things as sort of static concepts. Wouldn't beauty then be the saturation of algorithm within a given system?
But see, that's the issue. So that would assume that that's the same category that's just getting a quantitative excess that's gained in the same category. When qualities are about the addition of a difference, so it's a different category. It's that kind of shift.
But that shift occurs through the saturation. The shift, the qualitative shift is produced through a quantitative saturation, which saturates a given limit and then produces a new object, a new beauty.
I will say this. So I think what you're getting at, which is a kind of a deeper, a fundamental point. It is absolutely true that quantity and quality have a relationship in Aristotle, and it's an ambiguous one because, for example, position is something that is of a quantity for Aristotle. So, but yet figure is quality because it has a which makes what you can render figure in position, which is a quantity. So thus, it's like, what's up, Aristotle? You have this there's a confusion going on, or a potential misunderstanding. So, I will fully admit that in the Aristotelian thought, especially, this is a problem. Like, this is a tension because you conclude what you're saying, which is you just increase the quantity, and you will get a qualitative change. And there are many. Actually, I was talking with Daniel before the recording, and that's totally true. If you change the quantity of an order of magnitude, you get a different quality. You definitely do. So there's no denying this. But yet it is tricky that Aristotle does say figure is a quality. It is not a quantity. So but then I have to try and address that issue, which is, why does Aristotle do that move? There's something in addition that's happening. It's something more than just quantity increase excess that allows for the revealing to occur. Because it is under the assumption, we are saying that on this exam model of affordances, right? The revealing of affordances, right? So the example is goods would show you one affordance, and beauty is the infinite background space that allows for any affordance to show up. But I think the catch is probably, this again is a speculation because again, I'm just stressing that there is this tension in Aristotle, and I have to give an account why I can't fully accept this claim of just a quantitative change. Probably it's time. Like, the proper ordering of time does matter, and it's separate from quantity. Now that's a big term. That's not even justifiable necessarily 100% Aristotle all the way, but that's the best answer I can give you in terms of responding back to that. I say that because the ordering of things in time is a pattern too, which is independent of quantity, but it can be measured in quantity. You see, and that's the kind of catch here. Also, by the way, even the nature of the quantity, this is also the other part too. Aristotle does make this point about, right, position is a quantity, but yet, which is what makes up figure, because you can make a figure out of points, for example, which are in position. But yet, what the point, the unit which is used for measurement for quantity is a quality. It's an undividable thing, but it's a quality. So it kind of circles right back on itself with that move Aristotle does. So
it's autoregressive. That's the beauty of the dialectic, for instance, that it's autoregressive. So you have units, indivisible units, which are then congealing to produce another indivisible unit. Now, this indivisibility is not objective. It's an indivisibility vis-a-vis the computational limits of an observer. So this is a scale variant indivisibility. So
I got to interject, but no, the reason why it's indivisible, but the indivisibility is based on there's no differentia you can break into it. That's what makes it indivisible for Aristotle. No difference.
Yes, exactly. But that inability to detect a difference within the unified object, within the indivisible object, the inability to detect a difference within the indivisible object is an inability. It is a scale variant observational frame which determines the indivisibility of something. So for instance, I may be able to magnify an image and see the divisible points of a given figure, but if I zoom out and I have now my traditional frame, it seems indivisible. And so that this indivisibility is a autoregressive process that is frame or observer dependent. So we have this sort of like zoom in, zoom out, sort of like a reference to indivisibility. So when we talk about indivisibility or beauty as this indeterminate pool of affordances, we're talking about determinate affordances. We're talking about them in the abstract. At the moment that I'm looking at the determinate constrained object, I don't see the oblique pool of affordances. They are effectively background and effectively infinite, but that's due to my frame of reference. If I dive into that pool, I start to see, oh wait, there are some determinate affordances here. And that's the amazing, and that is a temporal, maybe adjacent capacity of the mind. But when we talk about beauty and we talk about the indeterminacy, we talk about infinity, we talk about a constrained pool of indeterminate oblique affordances, we are nevertheless talking about determinate vectors that are temporarily, depending on scope, rendered indeterminate, infinity, sort of like unitary items. So we have the figure, which is this unitary thing, yes, comprised of points if you zoom in far enough, but from the point of view or from the scope of an observer, it's a unitary trait. So I guess all I'm saying is when we think about how it is that beauty is produced, if we're to take beauty as sort of a saturation of vectors, well, beauty is produced by two mechanisms. One, there is a quantitative saturation. Two, the mediation of the limit of that saturation is observer dependent or frame dependent. And so when we talk about, for instance, this is why the meta crisis or the meaning crisis and these sorts of things, like if we were to talk about algorithmic determinacy, yes, and there's too many algorithms and we're flooded. But we become so flooded that the frame literally floods, and that algorithmic determinacy goes indeterminate, and what is produced but beauty? How can we say that no, one saturation is wrong? We're looking for a pre-existing saturation, a non-process, and this is where we get into Platonic problems. Because if we're not going to think processually and we're going to refuse that beauty can be produced by a saturation of goods, then we're basically talking about Platonic forms.
Which, by the way, I have no problems with. I'm a kind of reformed Aristotelian with Platonic tendencies. But I want to ask you one point, because actually what you say is subject dependent, I say is knowledge. It's an account. It's the logos that's being used. Because that's the point, because every account has a unit which they use for their investigation. And that unit scales. But that's the thing though. Knowledge is a very interesting property because it is something that is, Aristotle says, the only thing that is both said of and present in is the enactment of knowledge. It's very interesting because what that means is knowledge is something that is both a particular in this moment that one person enacts, yet is something common that everybody can have access to. When especially things like techne, for example, give you one. What I mean by this very particularly, I mean like technes, for example. There's that issue. But then the other side of it, I just want to share, is when your point is. So one was the knowledge side, and then the other aspect is, I think it's. That's what I was gonna say. So there are saturations that are better than others, because I'll give an example. I'll use the affordances, because that's the thing. So like we have an entity that has an affordance. Now you could use that affordance in many different ways, but some affordances, this is where virtue shows up, better or worse, meaning the enactment of the affordance is better in some cases and worse in others. And in particular, some of them destroy the object and some of them maintain it and some of them exceed it. Now, actually, a big gap actually in a lot of thought is, and this is from Nassim Taleb, is the idea that entities are meant to be stabilized, right? Kind of a fragile versus non-fragile or anti-fragile, right? Use that kind of language. So, for example, basically just getting sick, an entity, an organism that just gets sick, if it just gets actively sick, it doesn't then instantly become healthy. It dies. The container of that entity as a boundary edge gets destroyed. Now, using the Nassim Taleb, it is true that a certain amount of stressor, a certain amount of negation, of contrariness can give you strength. Like, so for example, you're putting your body under strain, you build muscle in response. But if you over exceed it, but that's the thing. But that's the point. It's not full saturation though. It is amount. It is a certain fittingness. Where is that fit? And that's the thing. It's the organism has a certain response to its qualities, that it can handle a certain amount of stressor and then generate something new from that, or generate something kind of continually exists actually better than when it was prior, according to that account, which is in actually the study of, for example, in gymnastics and playmasters in Plato, for example. That's exactly on this question. That's what they're investigating. They're trying to find the fittedness of the stressor to the body so that it can do the good conditional work. This is one qualities of virtue, for example. Okay, so I want to share that back. I'll turn it back to Daniel if he wants to intervene here.
No, Mr. Ebert first, please.
Just very quickly, yes. So that the hormesis, which is that sort of acute stress, which produces like anti-fragility. So it is never, in my view, actually, I wrote a little thing specifically on the evolution of the human brain vis-a-vis hormesis, exactly through oblique amplification, I call it. So you see the object, and then humans have the unique capacity to literally waste energy thinking about all the affordance space that the thing is not. So instead of the tree just having 5 affordances, food, shelter, and sex, and whatever, so on, we're able to be like, wait, what about a bow and arrow? You know, we were just mine it infinitely. And that, I think, produced the hormetic stress on the brain that may have grown the human brain in the way that it did. But I still view those moments, those acute moments, as saturation points. There is a final limit, a final systemic limit, which, yes, is death. It's always death, right? But that is not tantamount to saturation. Saturation can happen at any point therein. We're constantly producing false limits. So environmentalism is a good example of the entire strategy of environmentalism, is to constantly produce false limits, or, you know, I don't want to say false limits, artificial limits to human behavior, and be like, you know, put a stressor and put a boundary around human behavior and say, this is the final boundary, even though it isn't, right? Create these false peaks to try and drive behavioral change. We do this to ourselves all the time. Diet is an artificial limit on behavior designed to sort of push back the ultimate limit of death, right? So there's this constant artificial limitation that we use on ourselves to have a downward causal effect qua constraints. So constraints are the downward. So now I'm constraining my behavior to what I eat. Anyway, I just wanted to double tap on the bit. Yes, I agree. Not all beauties are the same. Not all saturations are equivalent. They are all qualitatively different, but they are all saturations. They are all probably awe-producing and or indeterminate in some sense. And so when I think about the problem at hand, you know, it is typically human and drive-based and sort of potentially self-destructive mode of thought, but the way out is usually through. And when I think about our general problems, I think about, if I have sadness, how do I get rid of it easiest? Well, I make my sadness, I saturate myself with sadness. I get so sad that it becomes funny, that it exhausts itself. I get to a point of excess at which the absence occurs. And that is a constant relation between excess and absence. So yeah, I mean, if I was to play God or to play dictator around the globe, would I actually enact a saturation of sort of capitalist algorithm, knowing that it would then absent itself and produce something beautiful? Probably not. I'd probably be afraid of doing that. But if I could produce some alternate universe and run the game, and I would certainly be interested to see if that's what happened. Because theoretically, that is what produces everything that we consider to be good. And, you know, for instance, if we were to look at the Enlightenment and then trace how that happened and all the vectors that finally converge to produce, you know, whatever we consider to be a Western good, we would probably see a lot of vectors that, if we had the ability to, in the moment, we would be like, well, that's not good. Let's get rid of this vector. That vector is not good. But then we step back, we're like, oh my God, wait, no, all those vectors were important. It's like me having a fucking heroin addiction and then finally coming to be like, oh, and now I have to confront death, and now I'm a more evolved person. Of course, then I don't retroactively suggest that to my child. but nevertheless, those vectors produced the beauty eventually, and I was able to evade the final limit and produce a false limit, which was my bottom. And this is what happens all the time. So anyway, I just wanted to say that it is possible that the algorithmic saturation, that some kind of algorithmic saturation is actually right now in the midst of producing an eventual beauty, possibly.
Well, gentlemen, this has been magnificent, and I am freaking sad that we're running out of time. A few thoughts that have come up. So basically, as I understand what you're saying, and I agree with, is that saturation is, in a sense, a good bet. It's a good try. Like, there's good reason to think that saturation is going to be at play when beauty is there, or you have some sort of transformation, say from heroin addict to getting off of it. When you have a move from good in beauty, there would be very good reason to think saturation is at play. However, it would be erroneous to assume that ahead of time you can say what that saturation is, because the whole idea of saturation is hitting a limit, and if you can predict a limit, it's not a limit, so there has to be an element of surprise. And the probability of the saturation, one could perhaps argue that the probability of the saturation actually being effective is to the degree it's surprising. If it is not surprising, then it is probably a false limit and a false saturation, and that strikes me as true. But even then, it can't be said that the saturation is quote unquote of a better quality, right? It could be, like you're saying, it could have a negative outcome, whatever that means. You're not going to put your kid on heroin or something so that they don't have a heroin addict, right? And yet, nevertheless, a surprising saturation that cannot be quantified ahead of time is likely in operation in some way when we are dealing with the beautiful. That seems fair. And the question becomes, how do we think this? So one of the things I'm thinking as you're speaking that I think is really important is when you're saying the beauty, we can think of beauty as a certain saturation of goods. That S is a big deal. Because we're not saying beauty is a saturation of a good. We're saying it's a saturation of goods. Well, that's the excess that beauty entails. That's the relation. And here's the key. When you have multiple goods, they tend to hate each other. When goods are in relation, that relation is defined of thinking the other good is not good. And so part of what is saturated in beauty is the conflict between the goods themselves. Because whenever we talk about goods with an S, we're talking about differences. I have no issue whatsoever of saying that beauty is a saturation of goods with an S, because we're talking differences that are fundamentally in conflict with one another. And what seems to happen so how do you have a saturation of conflict? How do you have a saturation of difference? It's going to be harmony, not a blob. Oh, I just lost electricity. Oh, crap. Hold on. Hey.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. And I think I have a really good my own take on, or a take that's informed by this conversation on those three concepts, which really actually overlays for all
Am I
this
back?
stuff.
Dang it. I'm so, we lost power. I guess the last thing I was saying is that if beauty is a saturation of goods, then it entails a saturation of the differences between the goods that then are in conflict, because to each good, the other goods are not goods. They're probably evil or bad. And that is being brought together. I completely agree that a saturation of algorithms with an S absolutely can lead to the beauty, but it entails the difference and even the conflicting program. So here is the question. How do we as human beings hold the difference? And that's where there's that massive challenge. That seems to be the beautiful. The other question would then become obviously an ordering question. Is the beauty saturated into by goods, or does the beautiful and the saturated goods come into existence at the same time, right? Which is duration versus sequence. If we want to take a more Platonic account, you'd say in the beginning was geometry. Geometry is discovered while algebra is created. And so you start with quality and quantity always already together. Therefore, the beautiful and the togetherness of goods is always already. Oh, and this is also really important, and then I'll stop, and I know we have to close, is that this is why the idea of truth as this disrupting character is such a big deal, because if you don't know that, then the experience of other goods that disrupt your good, you'll say they're false. They're false, actually, because they're disrupting my account, right? But if you understand that truth is fundamentally a disrupting phenomenon, then you can't have truth unless in your good, unless it is relation with other goods that destabilize it, right? And that's why having this take on the true as this destabilizing is so important, because you ought to assume you're false if you don't have that going on, which the fundamentally experience of good is that you're not false. When you think you're good, you assume you're true. There it goes again. You assume it's true. I have a backup. We'll see if we make it. Okay, it's back. Good. I put on the other thing. So we'll see. So this is good. So when you understand truth as disrupting, then that's going to help you from being deceived by your goodness, from thinking you're true. Because goodness does not feel like disruption. That's the problem. Goodness feels stable. But when you understand that actually you need good with goods, then you're going to be looking for that destabilization. So it all goes together. So before the house blows up or something, I'll stop. But this has been delightful. Thank you, gentlemen.
Godspeed, Daniel.
You guys are fantastic.